Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 2. First thing you need to do is get your journal complete. You need to write 4 to 5 sentences detailing the actions of African Americans during Reconstruction. You'll then need to list the different Reconstruction plans and the goals of each plan. Now, remember, African Americans were involved in a lot of various things during the late 1800s, especially right after the Civil War ended and slavery ended. So make sure you're detailing all of that information and then the various plans that we talked about in Day 1. So we're going to move on into the rise and fall of Reconstruction, I should say. And there's a lot of things here that we really need to think about. First and foremost, we need to remember that this is a time of prosperity in some ways for some, and then in others, this is a time of huge detrimental change. And what we want to look at is, number one, is Reconstruction actually putting the country back together, or is it tearing it apart? Because the whole idea of Reconstruction was to bring the South back to the Union and to do it in a way that they had to comply to the laws and the legality of everything that they had been so much against 4 years earlier. Also, was legislation successful during the Reconstruction period? We're going to talk about that as we go. So first and foremost, the Republicans, they believed that there needed to be some change for African Americans socially and politically. And they brought these ideas in hopes that it would change our country. And it goes back to the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. However, efforts from groups like the KKK and other Southern groups really undermined this, using a lot of violence and terror. Carpetbaggers were another group that were coming through the South at this time. A lot of Northern Republicans believed that if they could infiltrate the South, it was already very weak politically and socially in some ways, and their hopes were that they could take advantage of the very weak political system. Okay? Consisted mostly of former Union Army officers, Freedmen Bureau officials. Many of the Freedmen's Bureau officials felt like it would be a good chance for them to take advantage of the South and get involved in making some huge waves and change. They were called carpetbaggers because their suitcases were lined with carpet because they left so hastily. Scalawags, or rascals, as they can sometimes be known, were Southern whites who became Republicans. So very much in the same way that we talked about with the ironclad oath of denouncing the South, Southerners who jumped on board with joining up with the Union immediately were really looked at kind of in a very negative way. A lot of times they were very poor and they were looking at it in a financial gain sort of way. But African Americans are going to get involved at this time as well in politics. One of the first African Americans to ever serve in Congress was Hiram Revels. And Hiram Revels was from North Carolina, which is pretty awesome. And he served as a senator to Mississippi in 1870 and 1871. Now, some Republican policies, they tried to encourage economic change for African Americans. Obviously, we talked about land redistribution. Unfortunately, because the southern states were coming back into the Union, this was seen as a violation of their constitutional rights. Specifically the fact that they could not take private property and just give it to someone else. Now, if you get a chance, look up this article right here. It's the story behind 40 Acres and a Mule on NPR. It's a very good article. Just talks about how William Sherman gave them those 40 acres. Then they had these old military mules that they'd used, and they gave them a mule to hopefully help them plow on their new land. Unfortunately, a lot of African Americans never received their land or the mule for that matter. One thing the Republicans really focused on was the gospel of prosperity, which was on the construction of railroads, banks, and businesses. This idea that we need to let the country expand and grow. But policies from Republicans did little to help them, and many of the Southerners who were still there and still had money were alienating African Americans, and it didn't work out. Okay. The economy is also struggling during this time. Worldwide demand for cotton is falling. And guys, I mean, think about it. Southerners have lost the manpower of slavery. Now their cotton crops are falling apart. There's a lot of just bad things going on for Southerners right now. So one way that Southerners tried to continue to keep African Americans around is they did this through debt ponage. And what this is a planter would have a contract between him and a worker. And this worker, their job was to work the land, and they would pay off their debt before they moved on and hopefully make a little bit of money. The problem is that the planters generally hired former slaves who went right back to working in a field, and then they would increase the debt that they owed in various ways through, just conniving ways that they never could quite pay back the contract that they had signed or pay off the debt that they owed. And because of this, many parts of slavery actually stayed the same. Now, another way that farmers tried to get some manpower back on the farms was they grew crops, or rather workers would take land from a planter. They would grow these crops on the land that was owned by the planter, and in turn they give the owner a third of their crops. And so that sharecropping, as it comes to be known, is basically a way that they have land, they can make money, but then they can also pay back the owner as well. So in a way, it worked out in some ways. Sharecropping was very big for a lot of years. It was a little bit more of a fair process than the debt ponage. Tenant farming was also very popular to go along with sharecropping, where a farmer would pay cash for the rental of land from an owner. He would also agree to sell to a local merchant who would then, in exchange, give him tools and supplies. So once you made a little bit of cash, you could go rent your own land versus having to sign a contract or growing crops on the land owned by someone else, and then taking your crop and selling a good portion of it back to a local merchant. Unfortunately, a lot of times this didn't work out as well, but it just kind of depended on how good a farmer you were. But from DeBoe's review of an economic journal in 1868, this was a quote: "We do not mean slavery such as that which has been recently abolished, but some form of subordination of the inferior race that shall compel them to labor whilst it protects their rights and provides for their wants." So essentially what's going on here and what you need to understand is that slavery's still there, just in a very different form. So the Ku Klux Klan was an organization, began as a social club in Tennessee, 1866. Their goals were to intimidate African Americans and sympathetic whites, so basically those that supported African Americans. In 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Enforcement Act was passed, and this tried to stop the Klan from intimidating voters, African Americans, carpetbaggers, anybody who was in support of what was going on in the country during this time from a African American support side. Now, in this unit, we're just kind of reviewing Reconstruction. We went over Reconstruction more specifically in Unit 6, but skipping through some of those years of Reconstruction, we get to really what is the beginning of the Gilded Age, and that is the focus of Unit 7. And in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ran against each other. The problem is that there was disputed results in the election that showed both candidates had actually won the election. And so Congress actually had to convene in order to form a special commission to resolve the crisis. They had to figure out who actually won the presidency. Now, what happens here is really revolutionary to what's going to happen the next 100 years of history in our country. Guys, Reconstruction was an opportunity to change things. But because of this election and the fact that Democrats thought that they didn't want Rutherford B. Hayes to be president, the Republicans, they thought that the presidency was the most important part, but the Democrats also were tired of Reconstruction. Therefore, the Democrats, they say, well, you know what? We don't want you as president, Rutherford B. Hayes, but we will allow you to be the president as long as you promise to end Reconstruction, remove all these federal troops. Remember, we talked about the Radical Republican plan, pulling all these federal troops out of the southern states and basically going back to us being just a part of the country. So the Democrats convinced the Republicans to do this, and Hayes is declared the victor, even though he probably was not the clear winner. And that is the surprising thing here, is that the Democrats actually had a majority vote with Tilden in states like New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, a lot of these northern states where Republicans were a lot bigger, they didn't carry their state. So that's going to bring us kind of to a few things that we need to clean up for the end of just this kind of review of Reconstruction. First of all, the industrialized North. The Civil War industrialized the North. If you think about all the railroad travel, you're going to start to see the development of steel and all these various things, all these industries of textiles and even shipbuilding to a point. But the railroads is really what industrialized the North, and the use of factories that, to the point in 1873, right before we get to the end of Reconstruction, the U.S. actually had more industrialized workers than farmers for the first time in its nation's history. We ranked only second to Great Britain as a country. So, and our country's not near the size that it will be by the time we get to World War II. So that brings us to 1872. By this time, Ulysses S. Grant has been elected president, and his presidency is going to start off with one of the biggest scandals during his presidency, which was from a French company known as Crédit Mobilier. I guess is the correct pronunciation. I haven't had French in a while, and I'll have to go look that one up. But the company was basically a huge proponent of helping build the Union Pacific Railroad. And what happened is this French company had used their positions at the Union Pacific Railroad to steer large fraudulent contracts to their construction company. And this cost the Union Pacific Railroad millions. And so basically to prevent investigations, the directors had given Crédit Mobilier stock to key members of Congress and was using Congress members to keep it quiet so that they wouldn't get involved. But unfortunately, in 1872, Congress actually did investigate, and this actually revealed that there were some high-placed Republicans who had been involved in the scandal. And you can imagine what this does to Grant's presidency early on, but long and short, somewhere between about 1862 and 1872, there was about 100 million acres of land granted to corporations. So there's a lot of bribery and just illegal practices, things that do not go on today as much. Postponement of women's rights. This is going to be one of the big flaws of Reconstruction. To be completely honest with you, this is one of the failures of Reconstruction that is its greatest failure in some regards. In giving African Americans the right to vote, many women had been involved in trying to help African Americans gain their rights because, first of all, women got involved in temperance movements. Then they tried to get involved with African Americans and tie, the freedom of slaves with women's injustice. The problem is that our country never saw that as a big issue. And, women had been involved in various things, especially during the war. We see Clara Barton and her helping form the American Red Cross, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which assisted soldiers. And there was some sympathy from Republicans, but not enough to actually show full-on support. Now, Utah and Wyoming actually are the first states to give women the right to vote, but Utah did it strictly because they wanted to give more power to Mormon women, because they had a lot of women, because a lot of Mormons believed in having multiple wives and things of that nature during that time especially. And then Wyoming was just doing it just to attract females because they had a huge male population. So ultimately, Reconstruction is considered a failure. Our nation squandered an opportunity for equality and social justice. It will take another 100 years, almost to the date, for African Americans to receive the same freedoms that they were supposed to be guaranteed in Reconstruction legislation. That's something that, honestly, our country is going to pay for dearly, but that's the reason it's history. We look back on it, hopefully we don't repeat it. Now, here are your questions. Make sure that you answer these questions and log those into your notes, and then here's your vocabulary. That's all I have for you today, and I'll see you back here next time on American History with Coach Wilson.